For those of you who know how important it is to really have mentors as we go forward, we recognize that the important thing to do is to keep in mind that we don't do this by ourselves. And so just you'll see that what we need to keep in mind is that we are servant leaders. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And the objectives for this presentation are recognizing the impact of different leadership styles on developing an effective healthcare team, and then looking at some models of care that reflect servant leadership. And hopefully you'll see that this is all designed to celebrate what it means to be a servant leader. And the truth is that when we talk about leadership, it doesn't necessarily have a title, though often it does. And it's not necessarily said in any particular setting, because leadership is something that we see in life and in practice. And I like the words of John Maxwell when he said that leadership excellence is where competency goes beyond words. It's the leader's ability to say it, plan it, and then do it in such a way that others know that you know how, and then they know that they want to follow you. That's really what leadership is about. I would say for me that leadership was an afterthought until I joined the Army. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't a part of my life. As the oldest daughter in a group of 6 kids, there were a lot of things I was expected to do. So I would submit that many of us early in life are pulled into leadership capacities, even though we may not call it that. And for me, then I joined the Army. And this was something that was very special. I did not come from an Army family. I came from an immigrant family. And yet this is something that we felt was so important. And what I found is during the 22 years I spent there, that in so many aspects of what I did, there was leadership anchoring the way I approach things and the steps of my life. And you'll appreciate this as you see down in the left-hand corner of this collage of different slides, that when I was appointed president of our military Academy of Family Physicians, and our then 6-year-old son came, his comment to me, well, Mom, if you're going to be president, what will Clinton do? And so I remember then saying, well, there are different kinds of leaders, and he's still the leader, but I'll be doing something else. So my journey, as I mentioned, was being raised by immigrant parents, and I was raised in a rescue mission. My father was the superintendent of this mission for almost 35 years, and we lived in an apartment over there, the 8 of us. Went to a public all-girls academic high school, went to the University of Pennsylvania as an undergrad, and the University of Pittsburgh as medical school. And then I went on to do 22 years of active duty in the Army. And you'll see that I had many positions over time at different institutions in Augusta, Georgia, in the Metro Washington area, in Pittsburgh, and now in Nashville. And all of those were different steps along the journey that for me, I'm sure you will agree, we don't always plan. And then I stepped back and looked, been vice president of my Student National Medical Association chapter when I was a medical student. And I had been in a leadership position as a resident. There were very few minorities, and there were only 2 of us women in the program of 36 residents. So we learned how to do this. I was president of the Uniformed Services Academy, as I mentioned, at a time when 2 of my still close friends and I had to deal with the crisis that really rocked our academy, where our executive director, who also was the executive director of 16 other healthcare organizations, faked a suicide and then went ahead and stole all the money for our 17 organizations. We had to step up to something we had not seen before. Sometimes you say as a leader, you know what you're going to do. There are days when you have no clue. And that's when we reached out to Bob Graham, who was then the executive director of the American Academy of Family Physicians, to help us walk this pathway. I recognized the need for increased numbers of minorities coming into this federal medical school, and I was able to secure federal funding to create what we called the Firm Up program, which was facilitating the enrollment of those who are underrepresented in health sciences. And many different things like starting a federally qualified health center, becoming STFM president, chairing a physician inclusion council for a health system. You'll see this a series of steps over a number of years that I would say represented opportunities that came my way that I thought, I'm the one positioned here. I need to make sure that I don't miss this responsibility to respond and therefore take the leadership of. So when we talk about leaders, we realize there are many leadership styles. The best leaders don't know just one style of leadership. They're skilled at several, and they have the flexibility to switch between styles as the circumstances dictate. And so leadership is something people write about a lot. There's the autocratic style. And I learned a lot about that being in my years in uniform. It's sort of do as you're told kind of style of leadership. There's the democratic style, which is consensus through participation. Then there's the sort of laissez-faire style. It's sort of, we want to build a strong team, but everybody's going to do their thing, stay out of each other's way, and then benefit through innovation. But what you also realize is that sometimes there are different ways of describing it. And Blake and Mouton in 1964 built upon the original styles that I just described to say, well, you're either task-oriented or you're people-oriented. When you're task-oriented, it focuses on results-driven outcomes, and we don't really care who does it as long as the job gets done. Whereas when it's people-oriented, the whole focus is on determining which team member is most well-suited for a task, and then based on their skill set, their interest, and their personal development, being focused on the individual. So we realize that there are a lot of ways of looking at leadership. And then there's transactional leadership, which is very aggressively performance management oriented. Transformational leadership, focusing on leading high performing and engaged teams so that you can see just all the different aspects of working with these groups. Charismatic leadership, where so much of it is focused on the leader, often to the detriment of the organization because it's really all about him or her as opposed to the team. And then the one that I like to focus on, and I was delighted to be able to share with you, is servant leadership, which is a term that was introduced by Robert Greenleaf back in 1970. And where there's a natural desire to lead by serving others, meeting team needs, empowering them, focusing on growth, leading with integrity so that the team is guided by a moral compass. And so what it amounts to is we are function with teams in life and in healthcare, in academia, in every aspect of what we do. You all remember Jim Collins's work, Good to Great, where the whole idea is leadership is designed to know what you're passionate about, build to your strengths, do what you do best, lead the right team, and then know what drives your resource engine. And we'll talk about that. So why do I say teams when I talk about servant leadership? Well, we face a lot of challenges in what we do these days and things that we haven't encountered in the past. And so teams have the potential to outperform individuals acting alone or other types of groups. And they have the greatest potential for superior results because of the ability to engage the wisdom of the team. Now, for those of us who spent time in uniform, we realize that many aspects of high-speed organizations revolve around different types of teams. And in the military, you've got Navy SEALs or Special Operations Command. You've got the Rangers. You've got the Green Berets. You've got the PJs. You've got the Marine groups. There are many different types of teams that are engaged to take care of those most challenging problems. Using teams involves more people, therefore more resources, more ideas, and more energy than if it were just an individual. And when you do work with teams, it maximizes the leader's potential and it minimizes her weaknesses. These strengths and weaknesses are more exposed if it's just one individual. But when you put it together, you get multiple perspectives, all of which are good in helping us to achieve the goals we know are so important. Not only that, when you're a member of a team, you share the credit for those victories and you also share the blame for the losses. So it really fosters humility and a community that's authentic. It helps keep us as leaders accountable for the goal and allows us to simply do more than if we were an individual. So I would say that everything rises and falls on leadership. It is just key in every aspect of things. And the Marine Corps says that great leaders seek out and find potential leaders, then transform them into good leaders. And I love this one because it reminds me of my daughter-in-law who's a Marine. And it helps me realize that the Marines, as in many organizations, can take anybody and say, if you have the desire and you have the energy and you have the focus, we can make you into somebody who brings incredible value that you might never have thought. So therefore, what we have to do is assemble effective teams, right? That's really what we want to do. And one of my colleagues and friends, Kevin Grigsby, who has done a lot of work in academic medicine, started in Central Pennsylvania at Penn State and then the Association of American Medical College, said, you can learn a lot about being a team member. And what you realize is not everybody is a good team member. So you have to make sure that when you're selecting the teams, you select the person who not only doesn't just act, but actually can be the team member that you want. And it doesn't have to be a full team. It doesn't have to have a code of approach of things, but it does need to be something where you have members who can communicate well. And being and acting as a team player adds value to the organization and to you as the individual. But it's more than creating teams. It's how you think differently about how you behave in your own organization. It's about enacting team membership so you really are invested in each and other person that you're with. It's about pooling talent as we strive for organizational success. And it's about inclusion and drawing upon the wisdom of diverse perspectives and skills. So often you'll hear things, well, why are we doing this? Well, we've always done it this way. This is just this is what makes us who we are. And that sometimes that type of approach will hold you back and it'll hinder you from seeing where what we are needs to be something different or it hinders us from making progress and innovation. So when you think about that, I think about the former CEO of IBM who says, the thing I've learned at IBM is that culture is everything. And what do they say? Culture trumps strategy every day. So we have to keep that in mind because sometimes you have to go somewhere and you have to partner with somebody you weren't initially intending to partner with. And it may look absolutely appalling to you or unusual or challenging to form those partnerships. And yet those are the partnerships that allow you to get where you need to be. And so when we think about this, I think we ought to realize that there are many case studies that we can look at when we think about leadership challenges. And they can come in a variety of ways. And they can come in ways that I assure you, you wouldn't have predicted. You could have been at it for decades and something comes up and you say, this is a new one for me. And those are the challenges and the rewards of leadership. So, for example, when we look at clinical leadership challenges, I think all of us who've been in these situations realize that there are times when you know the things that need to be done. You say, okay, we need to keep our patient flow up. We need to make sure that we see folks on time. We need to be certain that we document, and then we need to make sure that we have good throughput, so that people come in, they get managed, they have their needs met, and then they go and you arrange for them to have follow-up. But sometimes what you don't see are the things that are not immediately apparent. What is the level of documentation that those who are on your team are doing? And sometimes, and I've heard it saying, well, I just have to be really quick so I can close my records, because if I don't close my records, then my name gets on a list and then people get angry with me. Have you ever gone back and looked at those records? Looked at where they are? Well, for me, starting a federally qualified health center and working there for almost 19 years, I would sometimes see the charting for some of my younger colleagues that were there in the practice, and I'd say, I know this patient. They were seen by this person, and now I'm looking at an encounter that occurred when I wasn't there, and there's no information here. I can't tell why this patient came in. Have you ever thought about that? Those are the things that, from a clinical perspective, leaders have to think about. Have there been issues that came up, and yet we didn't document well enough to be able to understand what's going on? And where does the documentation take place? We all know about the electronic medical record, but what about documenting telephone conversations? What about emails? And are they protected? What about my chart functions? All of those are things that are not often apparent to those in leadership positions, but yet being able to understand and have a system for monitoring is so very important. What about management leadership challenges? These are another thing that there are management textbooks. There are articles about management, but are there issues that is there guidance to each one of us who are leaders at multiple different levels of our organization that will help us to understand what are those things that we need to do? And management, of course, is revolves around how we work with people. And I'll tell you, I've seen situations where you find that there are folks who absolutely will not talk to each other, yet they're members of the team. How have you noticed that? What's going on? How would you notice that as a leader? I noticed that in one of my situations because I found that people were coming to me to tell me about what somebody else did and asking that I communicate with that person. And I sat down one day and I said, wait a minute, I've suddenly become a conduit for information when these folks should be interacting directly and problem solving themselves. It would have been easy to say, well, okay, I'll handle it. But that really is where you haven't managed it well, and therefore you're not using the impact that you have as a leader to say, you two need to sit down together and solve these problems directly, or else we have to figure out what interventions need to take place. And so often when we have these management leadership challenges, what happens is we're trying to make things go smoothly, which means we want it off our plate. I want it off my table. And so what happens is we forget that that when we're seeing this, that it is not usually useful to ignore a problem. Sometimes the problem will solve itself, but many times it gets worse. So what we realize is that management is doing things right. We need that, but leadership is doing the right thing. And we all know this quote by Drucker because it basically tells us that we need to do both of those. And we do that because we care about the people that we for whom we are responsible. Then there's risk management. So often we forget that the role of leaders is to be able to anticipate when the organization is at risk. Do you need to talk to a direct supervisor? Do you need to talk to a chair? You may need to talk to a dean. You may need to talk to your EEO person or HR or the general counsel. And one of the most important things is recognizing when you have to go outside your organization and that what you're dealing with is not a little conflict between two people. It's not something that can be swept under the rug. It's actually behaviors that require intervention by law enforcement. And if you don't identify that as a leader, you find that there are repercussions that are really difficult for the organization and for the people involved. Then there are the personnel issues, which so much revolves around that. Sometimes you wonder why number one I put there is space, because in every organization, it seems space becomes an issue. And it's something that it's an issue because it's it's like somebody's personal possession. They don't want to give that up. And all of the things that need to be done to manage space, inter-team arrangements, decisions, disagreements, whether there's been information transfer when there shouldn't have been, and how you manage this. These are all issues that seem to be inconsequential because they're involving a lot of people, but they really make a difference. And then leadership challenges in the midst of conflict. These are ones that, if they're not handled, they can explode and impact so many aspects of what we do. And therefore, it's so important for us to keep in mind how important it is to not avoid conflict. Good leaders are not conflict avoidant. They identify what's going on and then say, what are the appropriate next steps to reduce the chance of this continuing? So I'd love to give you a story about the fact that so much of leadership requires insight. It requires understanding your organization so that you know what needs to be done. And I want to use this by talking about position and authorities will give you followers, but trust will make you a leader. So you have to look at the work in which you do as a leader to say, am I building trust amongst those who look to me for guidance? And I would love to share an interesting story that was introduced in a book called Leaders Eat Last: Why Some Teams Pull Together and Others Don't, by Simon Sinek. And he tells a story that happened during the early days of Operation Enduring Freedom. And he talked about a couple of pilots of A-10 Warthogs. And you'll say, now, what is that? Special Operations Forces, they were performing a classified mission in a mountainous part of Afghanistan in 2002, early days of the war, within a year of 9/11. And this was he realized that there was a 22-man special operations team operating in a valley inside enemy territory, and they had recently captured a high value target. This is really up close and personal for me because just a couple years later, actually, our older son was in a small group in Afghanistan working by basically 16 of them by themselves for 3 weeks at a time before they could go back and refit. So this example helped me to understand that the importance of knowing there was somebody at above. So Captain Mike Jolly, whose call sign was Johnny Bravo, and his wingman were up flying these A-10 Warthogs, slow flying single seat armored planes above the clouds so they would be available to provide close air support for troops on the ground. And there'd only occasionally be any radio contact so that they would get a signal that they were needed. And I use this example because Johnny Bravo said in his gut, he felt as if there was something about to happen or something going on, and he wanted to figure out that he didn't hear anything. So he executed a weather letdown and dropped below the clouds to see what was happening on the ground. At the time, his instincts were confirmed because as he was dropping below the clouds, he heard the words "troops in contact" come across the radio. So he told his wingman, the other pilot, to stay up in the clouds, and then he told the flight controllers distance away what he planned to do. So he went down, and this was at night. And he saw that less than 1,000 feet off the ground, massive amounts of enemy fire were surrounding a special forces team. And at that time, now this is 21 years ago, 22 years ago, 21 years ago, the avionics were limited. He said he was flying with an old Soviet era map of the area that came from the 80s, making him worry about how close he was getting to the mountains while he was trying to protect his fellow troops on the ground. So what he did was he knew his speed, he knew his distance from the mountains. He said he did some calculations in his head to determine how many seconds he would have before hitting the valley wall, 1,000, 1,000. And he said, okay, locked his guns in position and then initiated enemy fire. At 1,000, he pulled back on the stick, made a sharp turn, went up and flew back into the clouds so he'd avoid hitting the mountain. And after a period of silence, he heard on his radio that he had made a successful hit. They said, keep it coming. So after several runs, he realized he had fuel, but he was out of ammunition. So now he's got to figure out what is he going to do. Clearly, they are surrounded. They're in trouble. And he's done what he can. So he went back up in the clouds and he said to his wingman who had been up there, this is what's happening. I now have a system. I know exactly how much time we need if we go down now and how much time before we have to come back and retreat to avoid hitting the mountain. You have ammunition. I have the wisdom. Let's go down together and I will count. You go ahead and engage the attack, and I'll tell you when we have to go back up to the clouds. And they were able to work this intervention by working together as a team, following his initial instincts, coming up with a plan, and 22 men went home, that went back and left that arena without any casualties. And when he was asked later, why did he do what he did? Was it that he just had inborn traits or instincts? Was it his education? Was it advanced schooling? Maybe he thought he had superb equipment or he knew his equipment so well. And what he said was that this is that he kept in mind years later, that it was a pattern of saying, I had empathy for those below. And I realized I was their best bet, their only bet for pulling them through a crisis. And he said, and there's a pattern that exists in organizations that achieve the greatest success because they outmaneuver and out-innovate their competitors. And the ones that do the best are the ones that with the highest loyalty and the lowest churn amongst those who are members of their team. They form exceptional organizations where the leaders provide cover from above. And so the people on the ground can look out for each other, knowing that their leaders will do everything they can. And they do this because they have empathy for those that they serve. So he said the single greatest asset to doing his job was empathy. And so when you sit down and think about it, when we approach a leadership journey, there are stages of development. I shared with you earlier, I didn't go into, I knew I wanted to be a physician, but I didn't ever think of the word leader. I didn't think about that as being the goal. And we'd have different stages. There's the I don't know stage. I don't know what I don't know. It's called being ineffective and unaware. Then there's I know what I don't know. I'm ineffective, but I am aware. I'm paying attention. Then there's the know, I know and grow, and it starts to show effective and aware. And then there's the I simply go because I what I know. They're effective, but they really are not paying attention to the changing factors that may impact them. So this is to emphasize that we're all at different stages. There's people who think of short-term leadership, and they're the people who think of long-term leadership. Now, Jack Welch from GE was the one who thought short-term leadership. It's sort of like you're dealing with an industry where there's a roller coaster ride of profits, and you just fire the bottom 10% to balance your budget. And I actually worked in an organization like that. It's stressful. It's very tough for those who are the middle managers and leaders to be able to work with a team when you don't know if somebody's going to come from above and say, I'm drawing a line on your list of personnel right here, and you need to get rid of everybody below the line. That's the short-term version of leadership. And then, believe it or not, the example of long-term leadership is the CEO of Costco. Stable, predictive stock value, second largest retailer in the United States, great predictable progress, performance, and profit, led by cultivating a strong, what they call circle of safety through empathy and trust. So what it amounts to then is that servant leadership is associated with core competencies: self-awareness, a culture of trust, stewardship for those you're serving, mentoring, persuasion, coaching, active listening, foresight, anticipating what may come in front of you, empathy, vision, humility, and continuous development. Those are the core competencies that describe those of us who look at ourselves as servant leaders. And I thought about that when I arrived in Pittsburgh, not knowing when I signed the contract that I would be the first woman chair in the School of Medicine, in this historic institution that had been around for a couple hundred years. I'd be the first woman chair in the health system. And I never thought that would be an issue because I'd been in the Army for 22 years. I thought, gosh, even the Army has progressed beyond that. And what it amounts to is all of a sudden in these new leadership positions, sometimes this little cartoon I think describes it well, and I'm really thankful for my family medicine colleague Leon McDougall at Ohio State, who allows me to use this image, where you feel like you're on one foot much of the time, and you're just trying to stay balanced between family and spirituality and patient satisfaction and getting your work RVUs and getting publications. It leaves you sort of, not just sort of, it leaves you feeling unbalanced much of the time. And I would submit that it's because of that we have to think about what is it when we see crises. And I would highly recommend you look at the book by Erica James and Lisa Wooten. Just came out during the pandemic. Erica James is the relatively new dean at Wharton Business School at Penn, and Lisa Wooten at Simmons. And what they say is, if you're going to worry about crises, step back a little bit. Crises are always serious, they always happen, and they're not one-off events. So if you're going to be a good leader, you have to say crises are going to be there. So how do I develop a strategy to approach crises? Well, they could describe the crisis cycle and the importance of early warning and signal detection. And I can assure you that is something that I have seen embedded in my career. What they mean is that you want to sit there and be able to identify something happening in your universe, your space, your business unit, your clinical enterprise that tells you something's not right. That way you can prepare and maybe prevent what's happening. And if it's already in the works, then damage containment as early as possible so that you can recover and then step back and learn and reflect from the situation. It's only by recognizing this and looking at it not as something that completely destabilizes you, but something that allows you to move forward, can you really do that? And you do that by knowing your personal mission. I would submit that when you go to any organization, you need to go with your own personal mission, because it's within that personal mission that you ask yourself, why am I here? What brought me here? Was I trying to find myself or trying to assert my ideas as a leader? Did I follow a spouse or a partner? Am I here to prove my worth to someone else, or am I actually pursuing my vision? And I love how Marshall Goldsmith talks about that. He says, what got you here won't get you there. How Successful People Become More Successful is a wonderful book because what it does is it helps you to start thinking about how you approach this. He says there are a lot of times there are these what he calls transactional flaws. He says you feel as if you have to win too much. You can't step away from the table unless you have come out the winner and the other person is the loser. Adding too much value, feeling as if I have to do this and I have to do that or we can't settle. Passing judgment, making destructive comments, starting everything. Well, no, I don't think we can. No, but no, that won't work. People begin to know you as the person who is, immersed in negativity, emphasizing to the world how smart we are, so that as if no one else is smart. Speaking when you're angry, something that I've always said to my kids. No, and I think about it when I talk to my kids. Nope, can't do that. Or, this won't work. Let me tell you why. Withholding information because you think if you withhold information, that gives you more power. Failing to give recognition to the other members of the team or that you're collaborating with. Claiming credit we don't deserve. Making excuses and clinging to the past. You see, he has a lot of things. And refusing to express regret when things don't go well. Not saying I take blame for everything, but refusing to express regret. Not listening. Failing to say thank you. Punishing the messenger, passing the buck, and saying, well, I do it this way because that's just me, and having this excessive need to be me. But not only that, there's another one that book that I think is so important in basically helping us to understand what leadership is about. It's by Angie Morgan and Courtney Lynch, two former women Marine helicopter pilots, talking about leading from the front. And they wrote it for women leaders, but I would submit it's good for all leaders. And they said that you have to meet and exceed the standards you ask of others. You've got to lead from the front. You have to make timely decisions. So often we want the perfect decision when the reality is we need the 80% decision because the world doesn't stop while you're trying to make a decision. Seek to take responsibility before you start to say somebody messed up and blaming others. And dedicating yourselves to service, taking care of those you lead, serve in leadership. And then think before you act, and especially before you overreact. And then I love the one where they talk about when faced with a crisis, go back to where I was talking about the crisis, aviate, navigate, communicate. And they said, this is clearly because we're helicopter pilots. If there's something amiss, the first thing is keep the bird in the air. Keep steering and then communicate while you were with your co-pilot, with other people on the ground to see if you can figure out how to solve this problem. Courage plus initiative plus perseverance plus integrity equals success. And you can't afford to cry over something it's not going to come back and help you any. And only say you're sorry when you're at fault, but always lead as you are. And you realize, why is it important to recognize who you are when you lead? Because people see you and you have to say, what is it they see me? And I laugh because I've been in sessions where I say, just a couple of weeks ago, I was in a meeting and one of my colleagues who's incredibly bright talked about what it's like to be short. She says, when you're short, people don't notice you. People think you have nothing important to say. You have to know, is it because you're short? Is it because you're a woman? Is it because you're a Yankee? Yes, I got that when I first moved to Georgia. They said, well, you're just a Yankee. I was shocked. I'd never thought of anybody. First of all, I didn't think of myself as a Yankee. I didn't think about people looking to me as a discriminatory thing because I couldn't know how to work in the South because I was raised in the Northeast. So it is important to understand who you are and when you lead, and realizing that leadership is the art of accomplishing more than the science of management says is possible. Aren't those words special from Colin Powell? And that's what we want to do as leaders. And as family medicine leaders, there was a concerted effort to figure out how we could build more leaders. So I was privileged that the Council of Academic Family Medicine chose Kristen Goodell, who at that time was Harvard, and me, to lead a task force in 2016 and 2017 to see if we could come up with a plan for increasing the number of leaders in family medicine. And we were able to publish an article. The first author is Catherine Coe, who was a resident when she started this, which I was just delighted to, and Cleveland Pickett, who was just finishing his medical school career at that time, and both in family medicine, to say that let's look at the different pathways to leadership. And we specifically said, let's start with students because the embryology of a family physician always starts with a student, right? And you go through to family medicine interest groups, the state academies, becoming a resident, and then choosing one of those career pathways. Doesn't mean you're locked into one of those career pathways forever, but it is a way to start. Am I starting as a clinician, as an educator, as a researcher, or in GME and residency training? And realizing that in all of these, we're talking about putting together multidimensional teams, and we have to figure out, are we how do we get those um, those mentorship functions that we know are so important. We get it from our peers, we get it through mentors who are have gone the path before us. Sometimes it's because of sponsorship, somebody who's way ahead and sees that you can do something in a different role and puts your name forward, or the coach who basically focuses on helping you develop specific skills and tasks. So I've also been working with a multidisciplinary team based at the University of Washington, but it's a national team, looking at how in family medicine leaders, we're looking at sponsoring, coaching, and mentorship. And we realize that all three of those functions are integral to providing careers to us as residents, faculty, and practicing physicians and teachers. And as when we talk about those who lead family medicine departments, family medicine residency programs, we have to know that we have very diverse groups, and that based on the findings of our work, which was a qualitative study, that we have to explore the things that make each of the members of those that report to us unique, and then help them to grow in the ways that they want to grow. Now, you might say that I don't have time for this. I'm having one of these really tough days. And there are days when you say, I can't move. Matter of fact, it's getting dark in here. There are a lot of pressures on me. I don't know how to function. And what you realize is that, yes, you can. We always have skills that we haven't thought about. And that I say we have to say, remember what charges your resource engine. You heard me say this before. For me, it's faith first, family, and focus. And I say that because I remember vividly the one in the middle in this picture, my older son, was embedded with the Afghan National Army for a year, where we had very limited contact during the height of the war, and how important it was for me to keep focused on the fact that I wasn't able to touch and protect him. But I knew there was a higher entity, that the Lord was up there doing that on my behalf, and so much better than my husband and I could be doing. And you realize that everything you do and everything you share as a servant leader can come back to you in many ways. And that's the whole team function. And so a number of years later, I had the privilege of going to Columbus, Georgia for our younger son to be promoted. And you'll see that there's a woman in that picture there. And I got there and realized when my son Ben, the one who's to my left in this picture, said, "Well, yes, Colonel Dominguez is going to promote me, Mom." And I'm sitting there going, "There can't be that many Marie Dominguez's." And what I realized was she remembered me as much as I remembered her. And at the time of where she was actually pinning him on, she says, I get to do this a lot because of the years I've been in the Army. He says, but I got to learn it from the woman whose son this is. Because when I was a medical student and she was a faculty member, she told me you can do anything you want to do. She said, I had a child at the time and I was wondering how I could balance it all. I said, you just have to prioritize and keep focused on the anchors that really help to keep you strong. To me, that was a wonderful return on all of the investments that each of us love to see as the academicians and leaders we are. So not all dreamers are winners, but all winners are dreamers. Your dream is the key to your future. The Bible says that without a vision, a people perish. You need a dream if you're going to succeed in anything you do. But winning has nothing to do with racing. Most days we don't have any races anyway. Winning is about struggle and effort and optimism and never, ever, ever giving up. And that's what we try to stimulate in others as leaders. And I would say that one of the things that helps me to be a real example about why leadership is so important is an article that I read a number of years ago about Robert Payne, who was an ecologist who passed a few years ago, talking about keystone species. And I like that, of course, as a Pennsylvanian, because Keystone State, but I'm just saying. And after extensive studies, he started examining the interactions of food webs and intertidal ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. And what he found was that there had been a primary keystone species, the pisaster, but with all of the industry and the overfeeding and the changes that we see in this area, the pisaster had really gotten completely wasted away in that particular environment. And what he found is that it had been removed, and the removal of the pisaster totally changed the control compared to the control area. And the whole ecosystem of the food web began to compete with each other with limited space and resources. And within 3 months of the removal of the pisaster, the barnacle, a particular one he was looking at, occupied 60 to 80% of the available space within the study area. And then later, another barnacle came on board also, and a mussel, because they were so rapidly growing. And so the phenomenon continued until fewer and fewer species occupied the area, and it was dominated by these barnacles and these mussels, and eventually totally wiping out a lot of the healthy population for that area. And so basically what he said was the keystone species exerts top-down influence on lower trophic levels and prevents those species at those lower levels from monopolizing critical resources such as competition for space or key producers' food resources. So I say to myself that when you think about why it's important for you to be a leader, why it's important for you to be a servant leader, I would say, because are you a pisaster or are you a barnacle? What's the role you play in your institution and your community? Because the reality is you're going to be one or the other. Either you're going to nurture the species around you, breed trainees, faculty, staff, those who you serve, those patients that are so important in our lives? Or are you a person that is just going around overtaking everything and not providing value? Well, that's because the truth is, as leaders, we want to be a pisaster, right? Leadership as a presence. And you know what they say, the pessimist complains about the wind, the optimist expects it to change, but the leader adjusts the sails. Well, I thank you for the time that you've given to me today, and I'd love to answer any questions if they come to mind. Thank you. So I know that there may very well be some questions, but I'm going to look to see what comes up. One question is, how do you recommend we at UAMS lead beyond our department or residencies, especially at an institution that doesn't prioritize family medicine? How do we have empathy for those above us? And that's such an important question that Dr. Ventris has moved forward. And I can honestly tell you that I spent almost 2 decades in an institution that for at least the first 10 years really just thought they needed to have family medicine to just get going. I was the first residency trained family medicine chair. I had to start our first family medicine health center within the medical school campus. We had 3 community-based residency programs, which were strong, which had created value for decades before, but were not looked at as integral to the medical school. And so the approach I chose was to demonstrate the complexity and the breadth of what family medicine has to offer. So what do I mean? What I mean is that this was a time when academic health centers realized that the majority of their revenues were actually not coming from inpatient medicine. They were coming from the ambulatory enterprise. And that in order to appropriately tap into that in the ambulatory enterprise, they had to polish and reorganize how that worked. And I said, we as our family health centers have to be models for that. And then the second thing was the only way in which they provide any services for the medically underserved were when they came into their hospitals and then they got disproportionate share funds from the federal government because of folks who could not pay. And I started to look at different ways in which we could generate revenues, but more than just generating revenues, generate commitment and trust with the community that immediately surrounded the health center. So I think that we have to speak the language of those to whom we report without abandoning our core values and our integrity. So we have to show them what family medicine and the commitment to family and continuity and primary care that is so important for us. Okay, so why do so many in our academic culture seem to follow a transactional model of leadership? I think we have been trained in medical and school and graduate school and nursing and all different types of health sciences schools to basically go on a transaction basis. Our measurements, the metrics by which we are evaluated, are done in an episodic way. And that then influences how we do things. Well, if I do this, will I get credit for it now or not? And the truth is that for those of us who believe in continuity of care and longitudinal relationships, you may not get an immediately identifiable reward with encounter number one. And so that already puts us in a different category than those who are episode and fee for service sort of oriented. Another question is, are there formal opportunities in family medicine for residents or early faculty members to develop leadership skills? And the truth is that each of our academic organizations in family medicine are looking for opportunities for those of you who were interested in leadership. First thing is you have to go to your regional, your state meetings, your county society meetings, and as well as the national meetings. Going to the American Academy of Family Physician meetings and having your chapter recommend you for serving on a committee is important. That was my first involvement at the national level, was serving on AAFP committees. You have to go to the Society of Teachers of Family Medicine because they have interest groups, a variety of interest groups. I assure you, you will find one that resonates with your core values and your areas of interest. And then it's within those structures that there are opportunities to move forward. Each of the organizations, whether it be the STFM and its Emerging Leaders Program, the ADFM and its Chair Leadership Program, and I was the first co-director of that program, all of these are embedded in our family of family medicine academic organizations, or CAFM, the Council on Academic Family Medicine. Each of those member organizations have programs that are designed to build leaders. You won't know about them if you don't go to the meetings. So I encourage you to invest in yourself to do that. How do family docs in practice do leadership before their offices? I think that right now, because there's such an increase in the number of employed physicians, we are losing some of the innovativeness and creativity that comes from people who run their own practices. And where I see that can be, you can engage in leadership, is being involved in your medical staff groups at the hospitals. This is something I worked hard to promote when I was in Pittsburgh. And I, as the academic chair, worked with the chiefs of family medicine at the local hospitals to see where there was synergy between what they were doing and the things that were their priorities at the hospital perspective and those of us who were in the academic space. And I think that way of partnering with the other family physicians in different roles is a way for doing your leadership, even if you're in a private practice. Another comment is, we are spread all around the state of Arkansas. How do people do leadership from a distance? Well, I would have said, that's a challenge until the era of remote platforms. Look at this. We're able to communicate today remotely in a multitude of locations. And I was able to see that while I was in Pennsylvania too, because we had 8 residency programs stretched 2/3 around across the state, including Western New York. And what it amounts to is that there was a 4.5-hour drive was the greatest distance between the two. And what we did was we used to get together for half-day conferences. And then we partnered together to do our scholarly workshop days. So at the end of the residency program, at least 3 residencies would get together and do their scholarship presentation or do their scholarly activity presentations in one setting. And we would make sure that it was a location that met the needs of all 3. And then one of our programs set up a cooking contest. Yes, exactly. A cooking contest where everybody brought their favorite dish and we judged the dishes. And people said, what a wonderful way to learn about research and scholarship. because we get to eat and have a great time while we're there. So we did innovative things to get ourselves together so that even though we were geographically disparate, we could actually share the academic priorities as well. One comment is, we've discussed enemy fire. Would you share insights for friendly fire when no cover from above may be on the horizon? I realize a minimal goal of holding your ground may be possible. Would you please offer tips for obtaining a victory? If I understand the question well, there are times where, first of all, sometimes you're not certain when somebody is engaging in something that's important to you. Are they friendly or are they hostile? Because what I find in the bigger organizations is sometimes it's not apparent. Somebody's approaching you about something and they say, oh, this is going to be really wonderful for you. And you're going, that's sounding very wonderful to me, or this remains to be seen. And so I think that, for example, some things you have to get started on and then let it go. Let me give you one example. At the early stages, when there was the decision to put hospitalists in place in the inpatient setting, we realized that we had some expertise in that area and that so many of our patients who were being admitted to our hospitals, we felt as if they weren't doing anything other than stabilizing them momentarily and then sending them back to us, but there was no communication. So we wanted to design the hospital service ourselves. And we put in a proposal to the health system and say, let us run the hospital service. We put a lot of time into it. And they chose two different departments to run the hospital services in a number of the hospitals: Department of Emergency Medicine and the Department of Critical Care. I was incensed. I said, why in the world does this make any sense? And I thought about it. Do you fight this or do you adapt? And so I said, you have to pick your battles. I can't battle that one. It's a done deal. They've already set it up. Another thing that came up, which was related but not the same, was an ability to try to get maternity care rotations within our main women's hospital. Even though it was a big system, all of the labor decks had been closed in our community hospitals, including the ones where all but 3 of our residency programs were located. So where our residency programs had a labor and delivery suite, it was primarily staffed by family physicians. But closer to the core of the medical school, those labor decks were closed. And there was one big women's hospital where there had at one time up to 11,000 deliveries. And when I went and said, we need rotations for our family medicine residents, their comment was, oh, we don't have enough deliveries. I said, come on, of course you do. You have 9 OB residents per year. I have 180 residents that are spread across the state, and I have limited rotation for them. We can provide value. Oh, well, you all never do OB when you finish your residency. And there was a whole series of things. And I just kept coming back and said, let's talk about this. I mean, we had a couple programs who could rotate there, but not all of them. Then that same hospital needed to have somebody to manage their medicine ward because they were moving the private internists to that hospital for their admissions while leaving the academic internists at the major teaching hospital. And I said, oh, we can do that. I said, we could have a team, and they actually came to me and they said, you all could do that? I said, sure. We manage our chronic medical diseases ourselves anyway. So we developed the inpatient service for the medical patients in that women's hospital. So when they were struggling to meet the time goals to get women in and out of their labor and delivery suite and the labor and delivery emergency setting, the triage setting, they came to me and they said, do you think you could do that again? Can you help us with this? And all of a sudden, the skills that we knew we had became valuable because others were getting worn out and didn't want to do it. So now we by the time we were able to move in place, we have our own, I keep saying this is where I was, but our own surgically trained family medicine inpatient team that rotates unassigned patients with the OB inpatient team. We alternate coverage of the triage department. And this came over time because we volunteered for the things that other people didn't think were fashionable. And that allowed it to be opportunities to be open to us in a different situation where we really wanted to do it. Somebody has asked, have you read Extreme Ownership? It is, yes, I have. It is an amazing book by two Navy SEALs. Jocko Willink, and I'm blanking on his partner's name. And it is a very interesting book about, these are two former SEALs who now are management consultants, and the importance of working together in situations where there are a lot of challenges. I believe it's it's an important book, not just for the military. Yes, I use military books as examples because you're trained from the minute you start to think team. And there's no I in team. Team is together, everyone achieves more. And so I find that these books help us to think as a team, as a group. And that's the only way we're going to achieve the goals we need to achieve. I'm looking at my time. I think I have 1 minute. Do you believe true empathy can be learned, taught, or is it inherent? I think some people are inherently empathetic. I really do believe that. But I also think that with a lot of work, we can help move people a little bit forward. Will it make them compassionate, wonderful folks? I think it depends. But I would not like to be surrounded by people who have to have intense empathy training because it's exhausting as a leader. I think that if you have one or two on your team, the others together can help work that, but it's tough. The long question is the last one. Okay. Family medicine residents are not just taught by attendings and professors, they also get taught things from departments outside the residency, nursing quality improvement, etc. How do you go about getting those folks more engaged in the residency program when the programs tend to shut out those voices? Great question. This is so important. I found that my most important allies were my nursing colleagues, my clinical pharmacists, social workers, and I'm totally biased. I have a son who's a social worker, behavioral health officers in the military. So I'm a real fan of social workers. Nutritionists, those are the ones that I pulled together in the FQHC that we created, because patients are persons first before they're patients, and they have a wide variety of areas of interest, and everybody is not good at everything. And if we're going to provide teams that help patients meet their needs so they achieve whole health, we need an interdisciplinary team, including those who are integrative and complementary medicine specialists as well. And I've been privileged to just winding down co-chairing a National Academy of Medicine committee, looking at the VA's whole health system. We need to start thinking whole health, which is whole person focused, which requires everybody on the team, not just those who have an MD or DO behind their names.